Two, and one. We're live.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for joining us for our first Monitoring Team Facebook Live Q&A information session. My name is Shantae Guy, and I am the Community Engagement Liaison for the Consent Decree Monitoring Team. To my immediate right, we have Seth Rosenthal, who is one of our deputy monitors, and to his right, we have Ken Thompson, who is the lead monitor for the team. To Ken's right, we have Jessica Drake, who is also on the community engagement team for the monitoring team. This is our first Facebook Live session. Because community engagement is something that's important to us, we were paying attention to the feedback that we received around recommendations for what meaningful community engagement would look like, and decided to give this a try. So I'm gonna take 1 second to get to the live feed so that we can answer any questions that you may have. We're making the assumption that folks who have joined us for this live conversation already understand the history associated with what led us to be under a consent decree for Baltimore City. If that's not the case, we're happy to provide a quick background. Great. Looks like we have no questions at this point. We'll give folks a couple more minutes to join us.
Shantae, would you like to give maybe kind of a quick overview like you did Saturday?
Sure. So after the death of Freddie Gray while in police custody, the mayor at the time, Stephanie Rawlings Blake, reached out to the Department of Justice and asked them to come into Baltimore City to complete an independent investigation of the patterns and practices of policing in Baltimore City. After the Department of Justice completed that investigation, they released a 174-page investigatory report that did indeed indicate that there was a pattern and practice of unconstitutional policing in Baltimore City. Shortly after that report was released, Baltimore City entered into what is known as a consent decree. So the Baltimore City Police Department, the Department of Justice, and Baltimore City entered into a consent decree that was ordered by Federal Judge James Bradar. And the folks that you see sitting in front of you right now are just 4 of about 30 or so folks that make up the larger monitoring team. The team is responsible for making sure that BPD complies with all 511 paragraphs of the consent decree around the reformations that must be made in order to ensure that constitutional policing happens. We serve in 3 capacities. The first is as arbiter, the second is as facilitator of conversation, and then the third is of technical subject matter experts who are responsible for bringing best practices from a national perspective into Baltimore City to make sure that that policing that happens on the ground is done in a constitutional way. Ken, Seth, you guys want to add anything before I...
Go ahead, Seth. I don't. I'm fine.
Yeah, that's a great summary.
Great.
We're still waiting for questions too. We could update maybe a little bit on what's coming forward in the next month or so.
Sure, we can do that. So we, the monitoring team, have been at this for a little over a year now. And there was a monitoring plan that went into effect in February. So we've been under a monitoring plan for about 9 months now. And the way that reform proceeds under the consent decree and therefore under these monitoring plans, the first of which we're under now, is that first BPD has to revise its policies consistent with the consent decree. Then it has to train its officers on the new policies. And once that happens, the hope is that community members will begin to see changes in the field, changes on the street, in the way that BPD officers interact with community members. Shantae mentioned that DOJ's findings were that there was a pattern or practice of constitutional violations that BPD has been engaged in for some time. There were several different areas in particular that the Justice Department found BPD to have engaged in constitutional violations in. One is that BPD officers were stopping, searching, and arresting people in violation of the Constitution, meaning without reasonable suspicion or probable cause. That's one. Number two is that BPD officers were stopping, searching, and arresting people based on race. So that's another constitutional violation. Third is that BPD officers were engaged in a pattern or practice of using excessive force or unreasonable force against members of the community. And finally, that BPD officers were engaged in a pattern or practice of violating community members' First Amendment rights, or rights to free speech, right to free speech. So those are the violations that DOJ found, and a lot of the reforms, first in the policy arena, then in the training arena, focus on those four areas. There are sort of some overarching areas as well that the monitoring team is focused on under the consent decree. One is that BPD needs to revamp its technology because its technology is stuck in the 20th century. And for us to be able to effectively monitor whether BPD begins to comply with its constitutional obligations and whether BPD itself can ensure that its officers comply with the Constitution, it needs to bring its technology up to speed. Second, DOJ, even though this is not a constitutional thing, found that the department's Office of Professional Responsibility, or its Internal Affairs Division, was not operating up to snuff. It was not holding its own officers accountable. What we saw happen with the recent Gun Trace Task Force trial earlier this year was proof positive that DOJ's findings in that arena were accurate, and that is one of the huge areas of reform that we are continuing to work on now, is reform of the Office of Professional Responsibility to make sure that BPD can police itself. Finally, BPD, as a staffing study has recently shown, and as many people know, is understaffed, particularly in the patrol division. And so one of the things that BPD is going to be working on is figuring out how to deploy officers in the right way and how to recruit officers to fill the ranks, particularly in the patrol division, in a way that is consistent with community values. So that's really what we're about, what we've been about the first year, and kind of what we'll be about going forward. Next year, meaning beginning in 2019, we'll really start to focus on training officers on the new policies that are being revised now, many of which have been revised, and also beginning in earnest the process of monitoring BPD's compliance with the requirements of the consent decree. Do you have any questions yet, Shantae?
Not that I see.
Not yet. Okay. Ken?
Well, you did a good job of doing an overview. I'd only add that next year we'll have a staffing plan in place. It should come on board hopefully in February. We need that in conjunction with the new police commissioner so that we can figure out, or they can figure out how best to staff the department that is apparently it's just understaffed right now. Second thing, we should begin in earnest some process towards working on the technology plan so that the technology at least begins the process of coming back into the 21st century as opposed to where it is right now, which is probably a 1985 platform.
Thanks, Seth and Ken. So at this point, I've asked residents what questions they have for us and that we welcome them. So we did have some questions at our session on Saturday that I think it might be worth revisiting as we wait for folks who were unable to attend Saturday's session to come in. The first question that I recall us getting was understanding the monitoring team's connection with the Civilian Oversight Task Force work that was completed, and what our thoughts are about what next steps look like from that work.
I'll give it a shot since I answered it Saturday. I'll be consistent. In terms of the consent decree, our job was to make sure that CODIF was being funded appropriately and that they were getting the type of cooperation from the city that they needed. That we did. That occurred. CODIF produced their report, I forgot the exact time frame, but sometime, I guess, this summer. And I guess it was June 30th? Late June. So that was done. In addition, the chairman of CODIF, Ray, came in, I think in August or September, and testified before the court. So the court had a firm and really a good understanding of what the CODIF folks had recommended. Now, from our perspective, most of, if not all of what CODIF is recommending is very, very important. We like what they've done, but essentially you're going to need legislative work in order to get that to be implemented. So without legislation, those recommendations won't come on board. But we're hoping that over the next few years that there will be enough of a legislative effort to get a number of the recommendations on board.
We do have 2 questions that have just come in. The first question is Facebook the best way to get in touch with the monitoring team? So as the community engagement liaison, I'm happy to answer that. Facebook is just one way to get in touch with the monitoring team. We also have a Twitter account. There is a website that can be reached, www.bpdmonitor.com. Our email address is info@bpdmonitor.com. We can be reached in our offices. The office here in North Baltimore is located at Baltimore Community Mediation Center. And we're here Mondays and Fridays from 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. and Tuesdays through Thursdays from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. at 3333 Greenmount Avenue, 21218. And your office address is?
750 East Pratt Street, downtown.
All right. So the next question that we have is, what assurances do you have that Commissioner Designee Fitzgerald will comply with or help to lead and implement the reforms called for in the consent decree?
We have let's start with this. We have a very, very active and strong judge who's overseeing this entire process. I have no doubt in my mind that this judge is going to make certain that all the parties, including the new police commissioner, comply with the terms of the consent decree. Now, it's my understanding, and again, keep in mind that the monitor team has no involvement in who the mayor selects to be the next commissioner, but we have been led to believe through the city solicitor, who we have a tremendous amount of confidence in, that the commissioner who's been hired has been essentially explained the terms of the consent decree. He is a reform-minded commissioner, we're told, and so I have every expectation that he will comply with the terms of the consent decree. But the thing that gives me the most comfort is the fact that we have a judge who will oversee this process and who will ensure that the terms of the consent decree are complied with.
And as Judge Berdard has said publicly, the new commissioner really has no choice but to comply with the consent decree because it's a court order. It's his order, and the parties agreed to it. The parties being the city, the Baltimore Police Department, and the Justice Department. And because it's a court order, the new commissioner will comply.
The next question that we have is, do you feel and or expect any impact on the implementation of Baltimore's consent decree from Sessions' parting actions from the Department of Justice, which I understand were aimed at weakening such decrees?
I've answered this several times, and the easy answer is no. The consent decree has been enrolled. It's a court order, as Seth just said. It's already operating. There's nothing that Jeff Sessions can do to change that order. So the order's in place, and the terms that are in place are effective, and this judge is overseeing it. And as both Seth and I have said, I'm confident this judge will ensure that the parties, being the city and BPD, will comply.
That Sessions memo is a forward-looking document, not a backward-looking document, so it doesn't and shouldn't affect consent decrees that are already in existence, like the consent decree of the Baltimore Police.
Great. So I don't see any other questions at this point, so I'm gonna circle back to another question that was asked in Saturday's meeting. Yes, there's water in the mini fridge right there. Pardon Ken as he jumps to grab a bottle of water. So another question that was asked on Saturday was specific to I think you probably already covered that one though, around the commissioner designee.
Can I ask a question?
There is another question that just came in. What's the most important thing that citizens can do to help ensure the implementation of the consent decree?
Good, Sarah. Yeah, that's a great question. I'd say that there are several things that citizens can do. One is to stay actively engaged and keep apprised of the reforms that are underway and that are supposed to be occurring under the consent decree. Pay attention to what's happening under the monitoring plans. We're currently working on the second-year monitoring plan, and to the extent that you have any interest in a particular area of policing and police reform, whether it's eliminating racial profiling or eliminating stops that lack reasonable suspicion or arrests that lack probable cause, or the use of excessive force, or reforming the Office of Professional Responsibility, which is BPD policing itself, make those concerns known to us. Shantae has just said all the different ways that you can get in touch with the monitoring team. We actively encourage you to get in touch with the monitoring team that way to express your concerns about issues that are of interest to you. Depending on where you live, there is also, and we actually have some of them with us today, there are liaisons in each of the police districts here which serve as our eyes and ears on the ground and are our initial points of contact for the monitoring team. Get to know your neighborhood liaison. Let them know what your concerns are. If you have good things to say about the police department and how they're reforming, let them know. If you've got things to tell the liaisons about how Baltimore Police is underperforming and needs to improve, by all means, let them know. That's what they're there for. That's what they're here for. So that's just in a general way. There are also specific things that you can do. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the police department is in the process of revising some of its policies. Well, one of the things that comes along with the policy revision process, and it's very important to the policy revision process, is making sure that community members have a voice in that policy revision process. And let me make clear, that's not just now, that's not just under the consent decree, but the idea is to train the Baltimore Police Department so that it understands that moving forward, even when the consent decree is gone, that it ought to be getting community input on what its policies look like. So the Baltimore Police puts on its own website draft policies under revision and seeks comments on those policies from community members so it can adjust those policies to meet community member expectations. We also, as the monitoring team, post those draft policies on our website so that community members can comment on those policies and inform the policy process. The same thing will happen, I'm moving now from policies to training, the same thing will happen in year 2 as the police department begins to develop new training curriculum on the new policies. So right now, for instance, the police department, in collaboration with the Justice Department and the monitoring team, is working on training curriculum in the area of use of force, in the area of the use of body-worn cameras, and in the area of impartial policing or eliminating racial profiling. Those training curricula are under development now. They will be produced to the public shortly, and when they're produced to the public, we hope that the public gives us their input on whether the draft curricula reflect what the public wants, whether they need to be improved. The last thing I'll say, because I've been going on a long time about training, is that part and parcel of training on these new policies will involve bringing members of the community into the police department, into the training academy, so that police officers can interact with community members while they're being trained, and that the community members are actually part of what we call scenario-based training, meaning that community members will come in and take part in the scenarios that officers are exposed to train them on the policies that they ought to be following. I hope I've gotten that clear, Shante, but if I haven't, please make it clearer. But the community, the long story short is that the community has really an essential role to play in revising policies, in revising training curriculum, and then perhaps most importantly, in training officers themselves on how to comply with the Constitution and how to abide by the new policies that are under revision now.
And let me just add one thing, and just to emphasize the importance of community discussion and input. You know, we do all this work even with community input in terms of policies and training, but until we get an assessment done, we really don't know whether these policies and this training is really working the way we want it. And the only way we're really going to have an answer to that is hearing from the community, so that when you see police officers out in the street, we need the feedback, because we need to know whether the policies that we're now working on with, or that we've helped the city develop, and the training that we're helping the police department develop, we need to know whether or not all of these activities are really getting us the desired result.
Great, thank you. Jessica, did you have a question earlier?
Actually, Seth Kachod, I wanted them to talk about what's working, and you did that already, so thank you.
And just from our neighborhood liaisons, as we're waiting for other folks to pose their questions online, what questions have you heard from residents out there that you think it might make sense for us to address during the Facebook Live?
Well, I'll ask one question. Residents have asked if they need to have a formal background or education in law enforcement or legal in order to get involved, and they've been a little intimidated. So maybe you could talk about the types of input that is welcome from residents.
We want a diverse support system, if that makes any sense. You know, if you got a legal background, that's helpful, but that is certainly not necessary. You don't have to have a law enforcement background. If you are a resident of this city and you either work here, play here, or live here, we want to get your feedback, because it's extremely important that we know how your interactions are with the police department. And so it doesn't, you know, your background can be anything. And we actually prefer to have people with different backgrounds, because that's how we get a fairer read of whether or not the police are behaving as they should and treating everybody in a fair manner.
So I'm going to apologize right now, guys, and introduce a little bit of levity in this space. We are not suffering from vertigo on this end. Darnell is trying to adjust the camera in a way that captures all of us in a straight profile. That's perfect right there.
Okay.
Freeze there.
That was a good question, by the way.
Are there other questions that you all have heard while you're out there doing?
So I think,
No, we've got a couple of other questions too.
well, I'll ask real quick, because this is one that comes up all the time. How long is this going to take?
Right.
You know, it's all, we don't know for sure. I mean, look, our job as monitors are to make sure that the department primarily meets the terms of the consent decree, which is a court order. We've heard from the interim commissioner just, I think, last month in October, that he anticipated 5 to 7 years. But it's just, you know, if I look at this as a football game, and I've said this before, we're probably in the second series of downs in the first quarter. We're very early, so you know, it's pure speculation to tell people how long we think it's going to take. What I will say to you is, I think it will take as long as it needs to get the police department right, so that it's sustainable. We don't want a quick fix; we want a permanent fix.
Great. Next question that we have is, have there been any reports from the community with regard to positive change from the public?
So, you want to try that, or Shante, maybe?
Shante?
So I think I'm gonna punt to you guys, as the report crafters, right, from an administrative perspective and the court filings that you're doing. It may be more helpful to hear, formal statements, if you will, around, change from the public.
Right. I will say that we have received, in the process of eliciting and obtaining feedback on policies, some positive comments from folks who have submitted comments on those, saying that these policies do reflect a change, and they're reflective of community values. folks who've made comments have had suggestions about improving the revised policies even further, which the police department has adopted almost in full, which is positive. And the feedback that we've gotten at the end of those policy revision processes is that the people who provided feedback were heartened to see that the police department was actually taking into account what community members and community organizations were saying about what they'd like to see in the policies. So that is something that is positive. As to changes on the ground, changes in the street, candidly, we have not heard any community comments yet to suggest that there has been a change afoot. I don't know. I mean, at least I'm speaking personally. I have not heard that yet, that there's been change in the way that officers are interacting with individuals now as compared to, say, 2 or 3 years ago. We have not heard that yet.
The closest we get to that is when I know Shantae and Jessica and I were at a youth summit. This was many, many months ago. And there were a couple of the young people who indicated that they understood to some extent a little better because of interactions they've had more recently with police officers, that things are getting a little better. One young man indicated, if I recall correctly, that he has developed a mentor relationship with the police officer. I think this was in the Northwestern District, if I'm not mistaken. And what he said to me that I will never forget, he says, I know, speaking of himself, that I'm not always right. But what I appreciate is for somebody, if you tell me when I'm wrong, if you do it in a respectful way, I can appreciate that. That's something that I find that I will never forget. I forget a lot of stuff, but I will never forget that comment that young man, and it was a young man, he's probably a 16 or 17-year-old. So I look at that as a positive step. And hopefully there are many police officers doing the same thing that the police officers in the Northwestern District.
And one of the things that we're going to be doing as a monitoring team in the next 2 or 3 months is surveying different segments of the community, actually to kind of get a baseline about community attitudes towards the police right now, what the community thinks about the police. One of the things we'll be doing is a community survey in partnership with the Institute for Urban Research at Morgan State University. We're actually in the final stages of developing that survey now, and the survey should go out into the field within the next month or so. In addition, we're developing a survey instrument or an interview instrument for custodial arrestees, both men and women who've been recently arrested and are being processed at central booking. That survey also will go live in the next 2 months or so. So the consent decree has built into it mechanisms for actually, in a scientific way, figuring out what community attitudes are towards the police and how they change over time. This is the first survey we'll be doing, so we're going to be capturing community attitudes now, and then we'll be doing a survey in the future to determine whether there's actually measurable improvement in community attitudes toward the police here. But that's one of the things that the consent decree requires us to do to measure community sentiment.
And let me just add this. I mean, the consent decree is in Baltimore City for a reason, and it's because we have a dysfunctional police department. I mean, if you had a good police department or perfect, you wouldn't need a consent decree. So, we would expect at this early stage to have folks identify a series of problems. I mean, what we want to see is over time, we'll get a baseline this year with this survey, and with the next survey, whenever we do the next one, the hope is that we'll see improvement and hopefully a drastic improvement. But that's the way we think these surveys should work, and that's what I would expect to see sometime in the near future.
Great. A couple more questions have come in. Many Baltimore police officers have asked how they too can reach out and feel protected from retaliation from the department if they have a complaint that they'd like to make themselves.
What's that?
I mean, the department does have kind of a whistleblower system that is, protected and is supposed to remain anonymized. And so, like any big organization, that's the protection that officers who want to make complaints and fear retaliation are supposed to utilize. again, as I mentioned at the beginning and as Ken has mentioned, one of the central areas of reform here is the Office of Professional Responsibility, or the Internal Affairs function at the department. To the extent that, you know, an officer feels like he or she is being retaliated against for having done something appropriate on the job, that is the place that they are supposed to go, where their complaints are to remain anonymous, and where their complaints are to be investigated. You know, very candidly, the Office of Professional Responsibility is one of the things in the police department that is most broken. And it is one of the things that, you know, we as the monitoring team are going to be looking at and are looking at most closely, and right now are providing considerable technical assistance on, trying to get them, get that particular division, the Office of Professional Responsibility, you know, up to snuff. So the hope is that going forward, officers who feel like they've got something that they want to say about what's happening in the police department have a place to go where they won't fear retaliation, and where they can be assured that their concerns are being taken seriously.
Let me
So
add
just
this.
to be clear, is that place OPR?
Yeah, the Office of Professional, yes.
And so as a follow-on question, related to that, given the recent Sun article, I think it just came out today, that specifically named one of the officers that was, or the primary officer that was a whistleblower against the Gun Trace Task Force officers in 2013, where his information was in an affidavit. Can we address concerns that potential officers may have if they want to make complaints? Is the monitoring team a place where conversations can begin to ensure that anonymity happens, and what would the procedures be associated with that, given just today's news article alone?
Yeah, and so if officers want to reach out to the monitoring team, absolutely, they can reach out to the monitoring team. And if they want their complaints to remain anonymized so that we don't forward to them to the Office of Professional Responsibility, you know, we will keep them anonymized, and we will take note of those complaints. Our hope is that even if it's not the case now, it will be the case that officers feel comfortable going to the Office of Professional Responsibility to register their complaints, because without the department itself understanding what the problems are, it's going to be very, very hard for the department to fix itself. We want a well-functioning Office of Professional Responsibility, so that officers who have concerns, who have complaints, can take them there, and so that fixes can be made right away within the department without the help of the monitoring team. Because ultimately, in the long run, you know, we're not going to be here. Whether it's in 5 years, whether it's in 8 years that we're not going to be here, this department is going to function on its own, and there has to be a way for officers who have concerns to register those concerns internally, have them addressed, and not fear retaliation.
Let me add one thing to this, because Seth made a lot of good points, but the first big point is we know that the whole system of accountability is among the most, I would say, the most efficient of operations in the department. I also recognize that, you know, there are policies in place, and we're working on policies in place to try to fix that. But at the end of the day, there's a culture in this department that has to be addressed. And from my perspective, the first place you have to start with is you have to look at the top, because the commissioner is the person that's going to have to step in. And in this case, since we know who it is, he's going to have to exert his will so that the culture begins to change. And so you can have all the policies in the world, but unless you have leadership in place, and that means not only the commissioner, but the upper command staff that are making it clear that any commander or any police officer who retaliates against another officer for doing his or her duty, and that is essentially disclosing information about other officers who've engaged in misconduct, until that culture is changed, we're going to have a problem. So we have to hope that this new commissioner will begin to set the tone. So leadership is incredibly important to addressing this culture issue.
Got a few more questions that have come in. Is there still consideration about some sort of secret shopper for complaint filing with internal affairs?
Secret shopper.
Meaning, is there going to be a testing program?
Oh, yeah. Is that what you
Yeah,
mean? Like
I mean,
audits?
well,
Yeah.
I'll answer that.
Yeah,
Yeah, I think
yeah.
that's the
I
idea, is
believe
that
so.
Secret
Yeah,
Shopper
okay.
is, actually sending people into the Office of Professional Responsibility to see whether complaints are being taken in the right way, and whether they're being investigated the right way. And yes, I mean, that's part of the consent decree, is developing an internal testing program to make sure that the Office of Professional Responsibility is doing what it's supposed to, and processing and thoroughly investigating and making appropriate findings on civilian complaints.
Thank you. The next question that we have is, what kind of best practices have you found so far to help inform our new police procedures and training? So maybe we can throw out a couple of examples.
Sure. Yeah, because I mean, the bulk of our work
Sounds
over
sensible.
over the last year has been revising policies, and we have, drawn on best practices in really every policy area that's come under revision, to inform what BPD has put out. So, to take something that I've worked on personally, I've worked on BPD's impartial policing policies, or its policies that are intended to combat racial profiling and to ensure fair and equal treatment of all members of the community. The Department of Justice, who is the plaintiff in the lawsuit to produce the consent decree, this is what they do. So they obviously have experience with best practices around the country, and they brought some of the policies that they have helped implement in other areas to the table. Members of our team also have been members of other monitoring teams. For instance, in Seattle, in Cleveland, in New Orleans, all those police departments are currently under consent decrees. We have members of our team who've been on those teams, who have helped craft policies in conjunction with those police departments, drawing on best practices to help combat racial profiling and to ensure fair and equal treatment. Just to take one example, so Seattle had to revise its fair and impartial policing policy within the last several years. We took what Seattle did, and the Seattle policy, and used that to help inform the ways in which Baltimore has revised its fair and impartial policing policy, which has now been revised and issued. So that's just one area where we've drawn on national best practices. But we've done the same thing in the arena of stop, searches, and arrests, and we've done the same thing in the area of use of force. Those have really been kind of central to what we've done. Also with the use of body-worn camera footage. Oh, and also one thing that I worked on was on First Amendment policies. Well, look, I mean, the kind of Cadillac of First Amendment protected activities, standard operating procedures, is in the District of Columbia, because the District of Columbia sees more protests than, as you might imagine, anywhere else in the country. And so the police department here, with our input, looked at what the Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. has done over the last 10 or 15 years to implement best practices in the First Amendment protected activities arena, and has adopted a lot of what is in the standard operating procedure for the Metropolitan Police Department, and what is now reflected in the First Amendment protected activities policy for the Baltimore Police.
Let me add one other thing. We're very fortunate in that we have a gentleman by the name of Randy DuPont, who is considered the father of what's called the Memphis program, which addresses folks who have behavioral disorders and the interactions they have with the police department. And I am very proud of, I think, the work that he is doing in this area, and it's giving. I think by the time he's done with this program, if the police department adopts the many recommendations that he's making, we should have one of the best departments in the country that really know how to handle folks who have a crisis, as opposed to arresting people who have behavioral disorders. We want to make sure that these folks are directed to a medical facility, which is where they should be, as opposed to having to go through the criminal justice system.
And Jessica reminds me, Shantae and Ken, that as she holds up a sign to us, that we have a member of our team, Maggie Goodrich, who was the Chief Information Officer for the Los Angeles Police Department, and helped the LAPD, revamp its information technology platforms so that they are now state of the art, and so that supervisory officers and command staff will have at their fingertips data that can allow them to supervise officers and tell them when they're doing things wrong, that can intervene and impose discipline for officers who need it, and who can look at department-wide trends to make sure that the department across all of its officers is engaged in constitutional policing. That is something that is sorely lacking, as I mentioned at the outset, within BPD right now. I mean, BPD's technology, I think, as Ken said, is stuck in the 1980s. And you're not able to get at your fingertips data that would allow us as a monitoring team to determine whether BPD is engaged in constitutional policing. Supervisors in BPD are not able to access that data. And so one of the things that Maggie Goodrich, our team member, has done is draw on what she has seen in the Los Angeles Police Department and what she has done with other police departments around the country since she's become a private consultant and has left public service. And she's drawn on those and helped inform and counsel BPD about what technological improvements they need to make. The police department itself has hired an outside consultant to do the same thing. Baltimore Police Department produced a technology study over the summer, which cataloged all the things that are wrong now with the police department. And they have recently put out a technology resource plan, which pretty much lays the groundwork for what the police department must do going forward to revamp its IT platforms.
Let me be real quick on this technology, and I know we have a lot of questions, but I think this is incredibly important for the public to know. And when you deal with a technology system that is unable to track officers' conduct, then you lose the benefit of what we call an early intervention system. And so what we want is we want to be able to collect data. So we want the police department to be able to collect data in a way that they can identify early on police officers who may be having or may have certain behavioral issues. Now, some can be counseled, maybe some need to be removed from the force, but you certainly want a system in place so that you can identify as early as possible troublesome officers, because you don't want those kinds of officers to interface with the residents of this city. This is where you end up with problems like we saw, this summer, and we want to avoid that. And so the technology is important for a lot of reasons, including being able to identify in an early way officers who may have problems.
Great. Another question that's come in is, how does or will the monitoring team interact with the Citizen Review Board and with the state commission, specifically Senator Ferguson's commission, while looking at BPD?
Some of the civilian review.
So
board.
it sounds like it's both, right? So there's a question specific to how the team interacts with CRB and how the team will interact with Senator Ferguson's, the state-led commission.
The consent decree, we have certain obligations under the consent decree as it relates to the Civilian Review Board, and to answer the question, I guess as succinctly as I can, our role is to promote cooperation between the Civilian Review Board and the Office of Professional Responsibility in terms of making sure that they get the information that they need in a timely basis. In terms of Senator Ferguson's committee, I mean, that's another committee that I look at as collateral to what we're doing. They are going to do investigations. We don't do investigations. Our job is to assess, but we see that particular organization as being helpful to the overall process.
And let me speak very quickly to Ken's first point, because I'm working on that personally, and that is ensuring the timely exchange of information between the Police Department's Office of Professional Responsibility and the Civilian Review Board. There is a state statute that requires that information sharing. It's actually two-way information sharing. If a complaint goes first to the Civilian Review Board, the Civilian Review Board is supposed to share that complaint with the Office of Professional Responsibility, so the Office of Professional Responsibility can do what it's supposed to do and investigate that complaint. If the Office of Professional Responsibility receives a complaint in the first instance, it's supposed to share that complaint with the Civilian Review Board, so the Civilian Review Board can share that, can conduct its own independent investigation. What we're working on right now with everybody involved, and when I say everybody involved, I mean the Office of Professional Responsibility, I mean staff of the Civilian Review Board in the Office of Civil Rights and Wage Enforcement, I mean the City Law Department, I mean the the Justice Department, and I mean the monitoring team. So all of these players are currently working on developing a robust protocol for the sharing of information between the Office of Professional Responsibility on the one hand and the Civilian Review Board on the other. The initial draft of that protocol is now due to be published for public comment right before Christmas. I think it's December 21st. Don't hold me to that, but I think it's December 21st. And so that protocol will be out there for a month or so for the public to comment on, and then the police department will take into account those comments in conjunction with Civilian Review Board, staff members, the Justice Department, and the monitoring team, and try to come up with a finalized protocol that should be put out sometime in the late winter, early 2019. So that's something that we're working on right now. We have a meeting on it tomorrow.
Given that the police commissioner has not been confirmed yet by the city council, what will the working arrangement be with the monitoring team and the designee?
Well, we intend to meet with the new commissioner. We have to assume that he's going to be confirmed. And we need to sit down with him to make sure that all that we have been told in terms of his mindset being reform-minded, we need to sit down with him and look at him and eyeball him and make sure that what we've been told is, as far as we can tell, true. So, I suspect we'll meet with him in the next week or so. That'll be the first step. Again, we have no reason to expect he will not be confirmed, but we operate under the view that he will be, and so it's our intent to meet with him, to let him understand that we have a judge who is very active and who's very serious about making certain that all of the requirements of the consent decree are complied with, and that we would expect him to deliver the way he's been represented to us, which is that he is a reform-minded commissioner.
And this is what we've done, and it's an unfortunate fact, but as many have pointed out, and as we are painfully aware, since we began here, we are now coming into our fourth commissioner, whether acting or confirmed. And so this is what we've done with everyone. So, within a week of our appointment last October, we met with then Commissioner Davis. When acting Commissioner D'Souza took over, before he was actually confirmed as the commissioner, we met with him as acting commissioner within a week of his appointment. I think actually it was 2 days after his appointment as acting commissioner,
Right.
2 or 3 days. And then after he left and Gary Tuggle became acting commissioner, we met with acting Commissioner Tuggle within a few days of his appointment. So what's going to happen when Chief Fitzgerald comes here? We will meet with him within a few days of his becoming acting commissioner, even though he hasn't been confirmed yet.
I think that covers the questions that I've seen at this point. If the neighborhood liaisons in the room and or Jessica has any additional questions that you have heard residents and or officers ask that you'd like to pose at this time, they're welcome. And for those of you that are still with us on the Facebook Live, thank you so much for joining us. You have 3 out of the 30 member team for the consent decree monitoring team. We will be doing Facebook Live sessions every other month. This session that you're watching right now is our first one. Our next one is scheduled for January 21st at 7 p.m. and will last for an hour to allow folks the opportunity to ask as many questions as they have real time of the monitoring team. We want to build a relationship with you all, and we want to take your feedback and your ideas forward. So please share questions so that we can spend the rest of the time that we have this evening answering those for you.
Shante, you may want to remind folks of the quarterly meeting. It's not too early to tell people we have a quarterly meeting, a quarterly hearing,
Absolutely.
and a quarterly community meeting in January.
Absolutely. Well, Ken just reminded you. And I will post the dates in this thread at the end of the live session so that you have those dates out there and available to you. One of the other things that you can do to take action based on one of the questions that we gotten earlier, I believe from maybe Peter or Dan about what other actions residents can take. Please show up for the quarterly community forums where we provide updates on status, where we get information back from you around your interactions with BPD officers, so that we are telling a completely comprehensive story when we're reporting back to Judge Bradar around what this path toward reformation looks like. So
And I did one more thing. I would also invite those who are listening. We need to hear from you in terms of what you might think of some of the better avenues of communication, because we don't know it all. We don't pretend to know it all. I mean, Shantae is great, Jessica's great. We have great community liaisons, but there are folks in this town who may have some ideas that we haven't used. So please, 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 I'm begging you, if there are ways we can communicate better with you, let us know.
Can I put forth a question that I think we get a lot as community liaisons? If I decide to get involved to provide feedback on a policy, be it body worn camera or something like that, what's the mechanism that a resident would be able to do that? Do I have to go to a interview? Do I do it online?
Yeah, so there are a bunch of different ways. The police department website itself has an interactive survey tool where residents can record their comments, and those comments are received by the consent decree compliance unit or the consent decree implementation unit at the police department. That's one way, and probably the most direct way. There are also a host of ways that community members can register their comments with us. On our website, we have a survey tool which allows residents to register their comments in sort of a very regimented way, and we look at those. That's one way. The second way is you can send us an email. Shantae said what our email address at the beginning, but info@bpdmonitor.com. If you don't want to be tied to the survey instrument and just want to send us an email, you should do that. Third way, you can give us a call. You can give a call to BICMIC's office here. You can call me or Ken at our office downtown at the Venable Law Firm, and the monitoring team, and it's on our website, and I'm sorry I haven't committed it to memory, but the monitoring team also has a phone line where we daily monitor the messages that we receive. And so those are all the different ways that you can give us your feedback on policies or on training curriculum.
And thanks to Jessica for sharing the dates with me. So the community engagement forum.
These are wrong. Those are not right.
Okay.
So January 22nd is the
Forum.
the forum,
Public forum.
the community forum, and January 24th is the hearing with the court.
There you
So
go.
actually, our next Facebook Live session will be right before our next community forum, which is perfect because we'll have a way to connect with community members via social media, and then we'll also be out in the community talking to community members as well.
All right. And so we'll close with one last question. Related to the current conversation, and maybe you said this already, but how will the citizen survey to be conducted by Morgan State be distributed?
So there are a couple of different ways that Morgan is planning to do it, though the methodology is being finalized. Tentatively, what the methodology looks like is that there will be people going door to door within the community and conducting the survey that way. And then there will also be focus groups conducted within different places, within different locations within the community, where researchers will be taking in people's feedback. But that methodology, like I said, is not completely finalized, but those are the two principal methods of taking in people's views. And the reason that we're doing it that way is because phone surveys in this day and age do not hit the cross-section of, or the cross-sections of the community that we feel like we need to hit here. So it's important for us to go door to door, and to do these focus groups, number one, and number two, because we want to amass not just quantitative data. We don't want just to look at boxes that are checked on a survey instrument. We want to take a look at qualitative data. We want to understand what people are telling us in a narrative way through conversations as well. And so that's why it's important to engage survey participants in discussions and not simply have them check boxes. We should also say that online surveys also don't hit the cross sections of the community that we want. So at least at this point, and maybe it'll prove different, 2 years down the road when we do another survey, we don't think that phone surveys and online surveys are the way to go. We think in-person surveys and focus groups are the best way to go.
Thank you. So, just before we close out, Ken, if you wouldn't mind just giving us any closing thoughts that you might have, and then we'll let folks know, as a reminder, when the next session will be again, and we'll call it a night.
I want to thank folks for participating. I mean, again, Seth and I both said this, and Shantae has said it as well. It is incredibly important for us to be able to do our job, that we get community feedback. And so I encourage you, if I have to beg you, I'm going to beg you. We need your participation. So that's my final comment. We need you to help us help the city, help the police department.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate
Thank
your
you.
participation.
So again, thanks for joining us. Remember that we're going to be doing this every other month. Thanks to community feedback is why this first session even happened. We are excited about the level of engagement that we saw tonight. Your questions were great and thoughtful. We want to hear more of those questions as we continue to engage. Our next session is going to be January 21st from 7 p.m. to 8 p.m. And between now and then, please enjoy your holidays and stay safe out there. Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.